everyone. See ya. Bonjour. Ni hao. Konnichiwa. My name is Shannon Kennedy, and I am the resident polyglot and language expert here at Drops. Every month I answer your language learning questions as a part of Ask the Polyglot, and so I am back here with a new round of questions. Let's get started. How do I learn a language with few resources, mainly Wikipedia articles and songs? If you're learning a language with few resources, the best thing that you can do is curate those resources to build your own tools. For example, find useful vocabulary, make your own flashcards, and use them to master the most relevant vocabulary to you. You can do the same with the lyrics. From there, and I'm not sure if this will be the case for you, but if you can find a native speaker or even a speaker who is at a higher level than you to practice with, that would be the next step you can take. If this isn't possible, there are lots of ways you can practice speaking a language without conversing, including self-talks, reading out loud, or even learning to sing the songs you have access to. Have you heard about Sorbian languages, Upper and Lower Sorbian? I have. And for those of you who are wondering what the Sorbian languages are, these are Slavic languages that are spoken in Eastern Germany. What are some jobs that incorporate language learning? Almost any job can incorporate language skills. For example, customer service. Being bilingual can be a huge asset if you work in customer service or even hospitality. The more obvious jobs with languages are translator, interpreter, and language teacher. But really, knowing another language can benefit you in almost any job. How to learn an alphabet? Through practice. Spend some time familiarizing yourself with the letters. One of my favorite tools for doing this is Scripts, our companion app. From there, practice writing out the alphabet by hand. Start reading very basic words. It's okay if your reading feels slow at first. Eventually, the letters will become more and more familiar, and you'll pick up both your reading and writing speed. And of course, we'll share the link for Scripts. Once you've learned a language, how do you continue to improve and practice it? Once I've established a foundation in a language, I continue to improve it by having weekly lessons with a tutor so that I can practice speaking and get feedback from someone who's professionally teaching the language. I also start to switch my focus from speaking and the basics to grammar that's holding me back. At the intermediate phase is also when I start to notice the grammar that I'm lacking or that I need to better master. So it's around this time that I really focus on it. When I'm advanced in the language, I work on getting as much exposure to native materials as possible. I watch movies, TV shows, play games, and read books intended for native speakers, not learners. It gives me a regular touch point with the language, and it ensures that I'm getting exposure to the language the way that it's spoken. How to become a native speaker in a new language? I don't think that you can really become a native speaker of a language that you weren't raised speaking. But that doesn't mean you can't get to a very high level or a native-like level in the language. To get to this point, you need to really focus in on little things. Your pronunciation, your accent, your fossilized errors, the grammatical mistakes you still make, etc. You should also start to pay attention to cultural references and idiomatic expressions that are common in the language. For example, sports metaphors abound in English. We say things like hit it out of the park, slam dunk, level the playing field, run interference, and so on. Learning how to use these kinds of expressions correctly can be huge. How to get over the burnout status when you learn any new language? I am very happy that you asked this question because burnout is a serious challenge for language learners, and there are as many ways to face burnout as there are reasons for why it happens. So it's important to consider why you are feeling burnt out. Are you trying to fit in too much? Are you bored? Are you feeling as though your progress has stagnated? Is it a little bit of everything? When you take the time to figure out why you're feeling this way, why you're feeling stuck, you'll be able to come up with a solution to get past it. So for example, if you are feeling burnt out because you're trying to do too much, you should take a step back and try to do a little bit less. See what you can remove. If it's because you're bored, try changing up your routine or resources. If you're feeling as though you aren't making any progress, start documenting your progress. You'll see that the questions that you had in the past are no longer questions that you have as you continue studying. And if you record yourself speaking the language, which is something that I like to do, you can look back and really see your progress. Any tips for learning Spanish? Any other resources to learn Spanish other than Drops? So I actually answered this exact question in our August edition of Ask the Polyglot, and you can find the answer to the question with the link that we'll share. Any advice on not losing motivation to keep learning a language? There are 2 things I recommend doing to avoid losing motivation. The first is to remind yourself of what your goal is for learning the language. Having that thing you're aiming for is good motivation to move forward. The next is to set yourself up for wins regularly. What this may be for you may be different than what it is for me, but I'll still share a few examples of what works for me. So one thing that I do is I aim to have a 15-minute conversation after just 90 days of studying a new language. And with the help of the Fluent in 3 Months Challenge, I'm able to do this. I also aim to meet my daily study goals, and I gain motivation by seeing my streak, the number of consecutive days that I've studied, increase. I am very stats driven. A third thing that I do is I aim to find moments where I can use the language and connect with other people. Sometimes it's just using a few phrases with my friends. Other times it's visiting a place where the language is spoken and using the language there. For example, visiting our local Persian market to complete the checkout process in the language, or even just ask where an item is in the store. These things, though they may seem small, add up and help me stay motivated to keep learning. It's important to find out what these are for you. How can I handle Japanese and Korean at the same time? So I would not recommend studying Japanese and Korean at the same time because they're 2 very similar languages. They have a lot of shared vocabulary. Their grammar structures are very similar, and when you learn 2 languages like this, language interference is a serious challenge. Language interference is where you mix the languages. So I would actually recommend to pick one of the 2, Japanese or Korean, focus on it for some time, and then once you've built a strong foundation, then start the next of the 2. What are the most essential verbs in any language? This is an interesting question, and the answer is that they'll likely depend on the kinds of things that you talk about, but it'll also depend on the language. In general, I've found the most common verbs to be, if the language has it. Some languages don't have a verb for to be. To have, to do, to make, to go, to come, to want, to need, to understand, to work, to use, to see or to watch, to say, to hear or to listen, to leave, to give, to eat, to drink, and to know. There are, of course, others, and there will be some variation language to language, but hopefully that gets you started. How do I track my learning with the CEFR levels? The easiest way to really know what level you are is to take the exam itself. Otherwise, you can self-assess using the descriptions available. I have written about the CEFR levels in a post, languagedrops.com/blog/language-proficiency-levels, but we'll share that link with you. Any tips on learning Mandarin? My tips for learning the language are similar to what my advice would be for any language. I'll share the advice I shared for a similar question about Italian. So if I were starting Mandarin from scratch, I would learn it by doing the following. 1. Study lots of vocabulary, especially related to topics I'm interested in. 2. Learn how to introduce myself. Talk about where I'm from, what I do, my interests, and my family. Then I would learn how to ask someone for that same information about them. What is your name? Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you do? Are you married? Do you have kids? 3. I would take lessons with a tutor. And in that first lesson, practice the self-introduction I had prepared. I'd then ask my tutor to write down anything I don't know or don't understand in the chat, and then I'd study whatever they wrote down between lessons. 4. Learn Pinyin and use it to start, then slowly introduce Chinese characters once you start getting familiar with the language. 5. Find a grammar you can use as a reference whenever you need to work on a specific grammar point. And that's it. What are the first things you do when starting a new language? When I first start learning a new language, I work on speaking right away. So I find resources that help me introduce myself. I'd learn to say things like, hello, how are you? Nice to meet you. My name is Shannon. What's your name? I live in California. Where do you live? I'm a musician. What do you do? I like reading. What are your hobbies? Conversations naturally evolve from there, and this gives me an idea of what to learn next. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Ask the Polyglot. If you have questions about language learning that you would like answered, be sure to follow us on Instagram and keep an eye on our stories. I'll see you soon. Happy learning.